start that now. All right, welcome everybody to our early detection webinar. I am Audrey Mettinga. I am the coordinator for the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network. With us today is also Shelly Stussick. She is the Go Beyond Beauty specialist, and she will also be moderating. If at any point during the presentation you have trouble hearing me or you're having technical difficulties, you can throw in the chat and she'll help get it sorted out. She will also be monitoring the chat for questions, which we will do at the end. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So curve stopping invasive species early. We will get into some background stuff real quick. So ISN is what is called a CISMA. We're a cooperative invasive species management area. There is one for every county in the state of Michigan. So we're a little bit unique. If you're not from around Michigan, you might know them as CWMAs, cooperative weed management areas. Out east, they are PRISMs, but we all kind of have the same thing. We're very partner focused, looking at invasive species treatment and management. We have some major partners. These are all people who sit on our board, and this is our service area over here. You can see Manistee, Benzie, Leelanau, and Grand Traverse counties. So who is doing the work to battle invasive species in the state of Michigan? As I mentioned, there is a CISMA for every county in the state of Michigan. You can see that map over here. If you're not from one of our counties, you are represented by another one. Federal agencies such as the Forest Service, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, they're also doing invasive species work. State agencies, especially the DNR, who does provide some of our funding for CISMAs. Nonprofits such as land trust or land conservancies, nature centers, and individual landowners, obviously, or else you guys probably wouldn't be here. Some of the work that we do, we have a few different programs. So we have our Go Beyond Beauty program, which, as I mentioned, that is the program Shelly runs. It's a voluntary program to remove ornamental invasive species from the inventories for nursery owners and landscapers. But also we've expanded it a lot to community members. If you're a private landowner, you can also participate in Go Beyond Beauty. And if you have any questions about that, as I mentioned, she's monitoring the chat, so she can definitely help out with that. We also do a lot of control work. So we have our top 4 invasive species, our Japanese knotweed, invasive bittersweet, garlic mustard, and invasive Phragmites. Those are our focus 4 species that we really focus a lot on helping our partners with, individual landowners, to try and control those. Our early detection and response species, which is what you're all here to hear about today. And our volunteer work bees. So in May, we do 4 different garlic mustard work bees, 1 in each of our counties. And then throughout the summer, we do some baby's breath work bees out on Alberta Beach. And you can always check out our website for more events and volunteer opportunities as they come up. We also do a lot of outreach because a lot of times we believe that people can't change their habits if they don't know that they have picked up a bad habit. So we do a lot of outreach so we can teach people about invasive species and why it's so important to manage them. And part of what we do is because habitat matters, and it's not necessarily just for the ecosystem, but it is also a big part of that. But also up in our area, ecotourism is a really big thing. People come up here to get out into nature. We have a lot of great land conservancy properties. We have Sleeping Bear Dunes. We have a lot of DNR properties. And so it's really important that we help maintain those to continue to attract people up here. You know, people are coming up here not to see a field of garlic mustard, but to see this field of trillium that's down here. And so part of what we like to talk about too is that part of the reason native species are so important is because they support so much wildlife. So you can see here in this graph, in this little graphic here, oak trees, the oak species are considered to be kind of the tree of life because they are able to support so many different species. And so then when you look at non-native species, there's always a talk about, well, eventually something will learn to eat it. And that's not necessarily always true. So invasive Phragmites, it's been over 300 years since it's been introduced into North America, and there are still only 5 herbivores that will actually use invasive Phragmites as food species or as habitat. And in its native range, you can see it supports 170 different species. So it's really important that we talk about, yes, maybe some will eventually become what is considered naturalized, but there are some that just are a complete disruption in the food chain. But another really important thing to talk about is what's invasive. The term invasive gets thrown around a lot. We often hear people talk about native vines as being invasive, such as grapevine or poison ivy. Those are actually native species. So in order to be considered invasive, what you need is it has to be non-native. It has to have few natural predators, so nothing else is really going to eat it. It's not really facing any competition. It needs to put out a bunch of seed production. So you can see here, this is an invasive honeysuckle. We do have native honeysuckles. They don't put out berries that are quite that big, and they don't put out that many berries as well. So that makes it very good at reproducing. And when you pair that with everything else, it can become a real problem. So we are here today to talk about serve the curve, but not this curve. Many of you may be familiar with this delicious hot dog that is made in Michigan. We're going to talk about the invasive species curve, probably less fun. But the formal definition of something that's invasive is a non-native species that harms people, the environment, or the economy. So what you're looking at here is kind of our textbook, basically, for invasive species. Introduction is when something has just started to escape, when somebody's planted it in your garden bed, and you saw one that was maybe not in your garden bed and just kind of pulled it out. That is like the ideal time to find something. When you can find something in its introductory stage, it's easy, it's quick, it's cheap to just manage it then. More often we're finding things in this detection period. So this is when it started to scatter a little bit more. You've got different populations of it around, but it's still, you can kind of see that light at the end of the tunnel. It's totally plausible that you could manage it completely. What happens oftentimes is that it then becomes widespread. And when it becomes widespread, we have to start having these conversations about whether or not it's worth the time and effort and money to manage it at that point. Money in the invasive species world, it seems very abundant, but because of the sheer amount of invasive species and how populous some of them are, it isn't always feasible to manage every single invasive species. So we really have to pick and choose our battles. For example, when you find one plant of purple loosestrife growing out, it's pretty easy to dig it up. You can hit it with a quick foliar spray, and then you can move on, check it again next year to see if any of the seed bank comes back. But when you start getting into 5 acres of purple loosestrife, that's starting to become a question about whether or not it is actually feasible to manage that. Another important part is, how did they get here? There's a few different ways. So sometimes they're imported accidentally. Invasive phragmites is one example. Zebra and quagga mussels are another example. Those were accidentally imported through barges. Imported for gardens is the biggest one. A lot of our ornamental invasive species got here because we planted them. A lot of nursery stock tends to be non-native, and about 1 in 10 of those non-native species has the potential to become invasive. So it's why our Go Beyond Beauty program is so important, because if we can stop it at its source, we can already, cut our fight in half. Sometimes we make oopsies. I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with autumn olive. That was one that was brought over here to manage soil erosion. Some people started noticing that birds really loved the berries, so then they had conservation districts sell them for wildlife habitat. And then we noticed that they actually were growing everywhere. So that is one of those examples of things that we did and then realized quickly that we needed a few more checks and balances before we started introducing things. Oh, skipped right through there. And the last one is imported for food or medicine. People bring herbs with them because they know what those herbs are for. They know what they can use them for. They're a comfort. And so they bring them here. Garlic mustard was one of them. It is an edible species. It's pretty bitter. A lot of people use it for pesto, but it is something that was brought here specifically for that reason. So before we get into specific early detection species, just want to run through real quick some of these takeaways. One of the things that you can do to help us with invasive species is you can report when you find them. So MISIN, the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, That is a public tool that you can utilize for reporting invasive species. When you report something and it's in my service area, it bounces a report back to me. So it's something that I can go check out, especially these early detection species. The sooner we hear about them, the sooner we can start managing them. Stop the spread. I'm sure everybody's heard play, clean, go. So that is a really important thing when you're out doing any kind of recreation. Make sure that you utilize boot brushes that are at trailheads. If you go out and if you're going out four-wheeling or you're going out snowmobiling, you can always clean off your equipment. The same thing for, any of your camping equipment as well. Don't plant invasive ornamentals. If you're in our service area and you'd like some information about where you can find some of our nurseries that are participating in Go Beyond Beauty, you can go to our website. There's a whole tab for Go Beyond Beauty participants. We have several participating nurseries. Spreading the word. So we have this planting guide, this Plan Before You Plant. It's one of our most popular resources. If you can find it on our website, actually under our resources tab, and it will show you popular ornamental invasive species, and then it'll show you native species that you can plant that are very similar in size, in flower shape, and growing habitats, and then you can find those instead. Getting involved in your community, which leads into volunteering. So as I mentioned, we have some work bees that we do through the summer. You can also find a local organization up here. Both of our conservancies, the Leelanau Conservancy and the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy, do a lot of events. You can check the conservation districts. Sleeping Bear Dunes, I believe, does a lot of volunteer events. So those are all places that you can check out. So we will now get into the individual species. Most of the species we're going to talk about today are on the state watch list, which means that there's very few of them in the state of Michigan. Black swallow-wort is the only one that we'll talk about today that isn't on the state watch list, but it is an early detection species in our service area. So this is a really quick growing vine. You can see this is several different vines that have actually just wrapped around each other. You can see it growing up the antenna here on this truck. It puts out these really small dark flowers here. There is another species called pale swallow-wort. We don't have that one in our service area, but it looks exactly the same, except instead of these black flowers, it has a like palish pink flower, almost peach colored. They have very small rhizomous roots that can make it a hassle to dig them up. If you break off the root, it can send up a new plant still. And it's really good at crawling over the top of other vines or of other plants, including native species. It grows very well up trees. One of the big problems about black swallow-wort is that it's actually in the milkweed family, but it doesn't have that staple chemical that the milkweeds do that the monarchs are looking for. If you get into an area that has a lot of black swallow-wort, monarchs can actually get confused about where they're supposed to lay their eggs, and they can lay it on black swallow-wort. When those eggs hatch, the caterpillars don't get that chemical they need, and they will actually die off. If you're ever out east or you're in Canada, they also have a problem with swallow-wort vines, and they actually call it dog strangling vine, which is a slightly worrying common name, but that was a name they chose. So in our service area, it's only found in one village in our service area in Grand Traverse County. The treatment can be a little difficult because of these leaves. I'll go back real quick. You can kind of see they have this like sheen on them. It's because they have a waxy leaf. So it can make it hard for sprays to stick to the actual leaf. So we actually double the surfactant that we use to help give it a little bit more cling. You can use a triclopyr, a quick herbicide background for anyone who's not familiar. There's selective herbicides and non-selective herbicides. So selective herbicides like a triclopyr, which is the active ingredient in several herbicides, that one, if you spray it on a grass, it actually won't kill the grass. When you have a non-selective herbicide like a glyphosate, which often is found under the common name Roundup, if you spray that on anything, any contact it makes, it can kill that plant. So we try to use triclopyrs a little bit more often, especially this is an ornamental vine. So a lot of times we find it growing in people's gardens. It gets out into their front yard. So being able to use a little bit more of a selective herbicide is very helpful. Unfortunately, when we get into aquatic areas, there aren't any aquatic approved triclopyrs in Michigan that we really like to use. So we do go to a glyphosate at that point. You can use manual treatment. So this is actually the little picture down here is an area where we have been using manual treatment. These are all seedlings. So you have to pull each one up individually, and it's a hassle. It takes a long time, but we have been seeing some really good results where we're having less and less. I think last year we maybe dug up 2 vines. There is a biocontrol for it. They've been released out on the East Coast and up in Canada. Some mixed results with that. There's studies going on in Michigan to see how effective it is here. So we'll stay tuned for that. Chinese yam is another ornamental vine that we have. They have these really deeply veined leaves. You can see that's very, very obvious here. They do sometimes come in different shapes. So you can see this is very spade-like. This is a little bit more heart-shaped, but they have these deep cuts in them. These ones you can see almost look purple. When they start climbing up something, they'll climb counterclockwise. It puts out a little air potato. I have a picture in the next slide, but it's also found under other names such as air potato vine, or it's also called cinnamon vine because these little flowers will smell like cinnamon. They don't really put out the flowers. I've never seen the flowers or the potato, little air potatoes on the population we have up here. But because these air potatoes are actually edible, you can find these vines very easily online. So that's this little air potato right here. We literally only have it on 1 property in our service area that we know of. It's found on a property that also had swallow-wort, so it was a really easy treatment. You can treat them pretty much the same way. Triclopyr in those grassy areas or uplands, a glyphosate in an aquatic area. Another thing to keep in mind, especially with these ornamental invasives, is that often they are growing in somebody's garden. So it's really important to make sure that when you're working with landowners, you're protecting the other plants that are around the area so you're not accidentally killing another plant that they want to keep. You can keep it, you can do it manually. You can mow it when it gets into really high populations. But if you are doing any kind of mowing, you do have to consistently do those kinds of treatments, because as soon as it puts up a new shoot and it puts out a new leaf, it starts photosynthesizing again, and then it sends stuff back into the root system. European frogbit, this is a new one for our service area. It is a free-floating aquatic plant. If you get into shallow enough areas, it can actually put a root system down. It has very, very small leaves. And you can kind of see here, these are all a bunch of leaves just growing in a mat. The underside of it will be a purple red. It puts out 1 flower. It's got these 3 leaves on it. And it has these, they're called turions, kind of like a bulb almost, that are on the roots. When you break those off, they can float away and make a new plant. They're much, much smaller than our native water lily. And so one of the ways that they actually think that a European frogbit is moving around the state is that it got into Lake Michigan and it's actually moving up the coastlines. When it finds a channel, it can get inwards and it can get into the inland lakes that way. And then it can spread down rivers, get on boats, get spread through lakes that way. So this is actually, this top picture here is from Portage Lake, which is where we had our first confirmed population. It was treated last summer by the Portage Lake Association. They had contractors out there. So for treatment for European frogbit, aquatic treatments with any species can be very difficult. If anybody's ever worked with Eurasian milfoil, they're well aware. There's different herbicides that you can use. It was sprayed last year in Portage Lake. Most people will often do a manual treatment, which is what you can see here with 2 different people. This is through MSU Extensions, the state of Michigan, which is literally just grabbing handfuls of it, pulling it out of the water, putting it into some way to transport it off the lake, and then pulling it well away from another source of water, letting it dry out. That's usually what a lot of people are using. Sometimes they'll mix manual with an herbicide. It just depends on the infestation that you have. Hemlock woolly adelgid. If you follow ISN, you're probably really tired of hearing me talk about hemlock woolly adelgid, HWA. That's been one that we've been monitoring for since 2019. It's been in the state for a while longer. It is an invasive insect pest. It's been going along the lakeshore because we have that very nice little fruit belt where we stay a little bit warmer than it gets in the middle of the state through the winter. It actually needs that warmer temperature to overwinter well. So You really can't see it when it's in its crawler stage. You can see up here, this is its life cycle. It goes into a crawler stage in early spring, and then through the summer. It's very easy to spread when it's in its crawler stage. It's literally just brushing against one hemlock. You move half a mile down the trail and brush it against another hemlock, and you can spread it that way. We do these surveys in the wintertime. One of our coworkers is actually out today doing some surveys. In the wintertime, it puts out these little white ovisacs, which is actually just, it's put this fluff around itself, and it's what it keeps itself warm in. And so those are actually very visible, and that's why we survey for it in the winter time. And also it's very difficult to spread when it's in this ovisac. Basically, you have to hit like the right time period to spread it when it's in an ovisac, and it's a very narrow gap. You'll often find them, not often, you always find them at the base of the needle. What the insect does is it inserts a little mouthpiece into the branch, and it'll start sucking the nutrients from the branch. The hemlock realizes something's wrong, cuts off nutrients to that branch, and eventually, because HWA can spread through the tree so quickly, eventually the tree will actually kill itself. This is not one of the things that we've really been communicating with landowners, is that it's not emerald ash borer. So if a tree gets infested, it's not going to be dead in 2 years. We've got about 5 to 10 years to do treatments. And down in the Grand Rapids area, they've been having a lot of success actually with saving trees. This is a really big problem out on the East Coast. It's basically gone through the Appalachian Mountains a couple of times at this point. You can see valleys where it's just dead trees. They have moved on to the strategy of picking trees to save and doing treatments with those trees. We are not at that point so far. When we find it, we treat it. And we've been able to do a really good job of preventing mass death. It's, like I said, very easy to spread through human means. So that play, clean, go is so important. If you're down in an area that's got HWA and you're coming back up here, you've gone camping, you've gone hiking, a quick decontamination of your equipment can be so helpful. We don't have it in our service area right now. We had a really close call in 2021 out at Sleeping Bear Dunes. You can actually see this is me doing treatment out there. They found one tree out there that had HWA in it. Because it's an early detection species, we were able to mobilize really quickly. We got through MDARD, we got the DNR. We went out and helped the Sleeping Bear Dunes. They have their own crew that was out there. And pretty much like within the week, we were out doing extensive surveys. ISN was able to do surveys of the private property around the park. And then in the beginning of May, we were out doing treatments. Sleeping Bear trimmed all of the branches off the tree that had HWA, and we found no other trees that had HWA, and there hasn't been any HWA found at the campground since then. So not even considered a new population. This is literally the reason why early detection species are so important, is because we were able to get out there and take care of it, and now we still don't have HWA in our service area. Like I said, treatments have been shown to be really effective. There's dinotefuran, which is a short term, everything's pretty much done through tree injections, unless the tree is too small, in which case there's a basal bark spraying, which is just spraying herbicide basically around the tree, and the tree will soak in that herbicide. So dinotefuran is a short term, it lasts about 2 to 3 years in the tree, but it does start working instantly. And then there's the minocloprid, which is a longer term, about 7 to 8 years, but it does take about 2 years to become active throughout the whole tree. So that one tree that had HWA was treated with both of them. So you got both of those benefits, quick working, long lasting. There is a biocontrol that's been used out east. It hasn't been super effective in Michigan, so we don't currently use it. It doesn't overwinter well, and even when it does overwinter well, it actually is, it goes underground and hibernates during one of the reproduction stages of HWA. So it kind of misses an entire generation. So it's not used in Michigan currently. Spotted lanternfly, we're moving into ones that we don't have in our service area that we know of. Spotted lanternfly was one we've been waiting for a long time. Another big problem out east, Pennsylvania, New York. They've had a lot of problems with it. It is a generalist feeder, so it's kind of doing the same thing. It's sucking nutrients out of the plant. The problem is that it does prefer grapevines and fruit trees, which is pretty big industry up here. So we've had a lot of people pretty worried about it. it does also prefer the invasive tree of heaven. This is an ornamental tree that was brought over. Turns out it does a really good job of spreading and making entire groves. It's kind of difficult to treat because it does have a tendency to throw up a bunch of suckers. So when you cut it, the root system panics and then throws up new plants all around it. So it does prefer the invasive tree of heaven, but it will eat pretty much anything. It doesn't actually fly, even though it's called a lanternfly. It's considered a leafhopper, so it kind of just jumps really far, and its wings are there for helping it get some movement going. It lays mud-like egg masses. You can see it here. I've got a picture in the other slide too of an actual one. And it goes through these 4 instar stages before it gets to this really familiar little moth that everybody's used to seeing. You can see in the picture down here, these are all this final instar. It gets bright red. It's very, very eye-catching. But when it's young, it's just got black with some white dots on it. One of the other problems is that when spotted lanternfly feeds, it causes plants to leak sap, and also spotted lanternflies excrete a honeydew, and it can attract forms of mildew and other insects that will come and feed on that, which can further damage those vines or trees, whatever it's feeding on. There were 2 discoveries of dead lanternflies in Michigan. One of them came through on a train. The first live lanternfly was discovered in late summer, I believe it was August, down in Oakland County. It came in on nursery tree stock. Well, lanternflies can't actually fly. They're very good at laying these egg masses on literally anything. Train cars, your wheels, a camper. If it's a flat enough surface to put out this tiny little egg sac, it will lay an egg on it. So that it moves around so easily because it's found other ways of moving out of the state than flying. So the spot that they found last summer, they did a lot of extensive surveys. They treated a bunch of tree of heaven, but they did leave some because it can actually be what's called a sentinel tree. So they leave up some of them because they know that lanternflies will go back to those trees, and then that way they can track if there's new populations of spotted lanternfly in the area. MDARD, who has managed all of this, they do expect spotted lanternfly to show up again in Michigan. So they're asking everybody to keep an eye out. As you can see, these adults are very, very eye-catching. There's a lot of jokes going on around about how pretty they are. But if you do see them, you can report them to MDARD, or you can report them on missing. Those reports also go to MDARD. Mile a minute weed. It is called mile a minute weed because it does actually seem to grow pretty much a mile in a minute. It grows about 25 feet in 6 to 8 weeks, which is an insane number. It's an annual vine, which is why it grows so much. It has triangle-shaped leaves. It is very commonly mistaken with bindweed. I've had panic attacks before when I saw bindweed. So these are a comparison here. This is mile a minute weed. It's got a straight, you can kind of see here too, it's got a straight little margin right there. And you can see these little thorns going down the stalk of this plant. Bindweed won't have those thorns. It also has a cutout on the leaves of it. Bindweed also puts out this really big white flower. It's very eye-catching. Mile a minute weed doesn't do that, but what it does is it puts out these porcelain-looking berries, and it has these weird leaves that go underneath where a berry is. They're actually kind of like a cup, and then the berries grow out of that cup. They don't really climb very well. There's going to be a picture in the next slide. You'll see that it is kind of climbing, but they're actually more of a crawler. They just kind of crawl over the top of everything. Right now, they're only found in southern Michigan. So this is actually from that site down, one of the sites down there. You can see it's hasn't really, you can kind of see a little bit where it's crawled up, but this is actually a fallen tree. So it kind of just crawled over the fallen tree. It's a little bit up in the trees here. But for the most part, it's just going to stay on the ground level and just crawl over everything until all you have is a field of mile a minute weed. You can actually do manual treatment for this. It can be mowed or tilled, but like I mentioned, because it's such a fast grower, you do have to do it very often. So for mile a minute weed, it's about once a week you would have to go out and mow it. It's really only feasible for small populations that grow in certain areas. This area that it was actually growing in was kind of wet, which would make it very difficult to do that treatment. There has been some success out in Pennsylvania treating it with a pre-emergent herbicide. It was tried in Michigan for one season. They didn't have great success with it, but they think that they found the reason for that, and they're going to try and fix it and see if that helps. Otherwise, you can foliar spray it. It dies very quickly. They said like within an hour, you can see like brown curling leaves. So it does respond to treatment pretty well. Himalayan balsam. This is an annual herbaceous plant. It grows about 3 to 6 feet tall. It has these really showy flowers. You can see they're actually quite beautiful. They can grow in a lot of different soil types, but we do tend to find them in riparian corridors, which is a problem because these seed pods, which another common name for Himalayan balsam is touch-me-not, because these seed pods, when you touch them and they're fully mature, they will explode and send the seeds everywhere. They can actually travel down waterways as well, which can be one way that they spread. It's found mostly in the eastern UP and then across the St. Mary's River into Canada. So the SISMA that is up in that area called Three Shores SISMA, they do a lot of treatment with this. So you can see this is one of their crew members hiding in Himalayan balsam. Manual treatment is actually pretty effective. You can see here, this is the root system. It's incredibly shallow. It's very easy to pull them out of the ground, even in some of those muckier soils. You can also do chemical treatment if you foliar spray it in the spring before it flowers. It is pretty effective. Remember though that if you are spraying in an aquatic area, you do need to use an aquatic approved herbicide. One of the really big problems with Himalayan balsam is that it can actually alter water flow if the populations get heavy enough in the riparian area, and then that can cause erosion and flooding. And it has actually been shown to alter behavior in the composition of pollinators in the area. So it's one that, like I said, it's only really up in the eastern UP, but they do have a really bad problem with it, and it is across into Canada. So they've been working with it for several years at this point. And that was our last early detection species that I had on my presentation. So some of these submitted questions, I had a lot of questions about how to do invasive species treatments. And that answer is a little complicated because it depends on the species. So if you are going to be working on woody invasives, cut stump treatments are usually the best method for that. We have on a resources page, we do have a whole PDF about how to do those treatments. We also do autumn olive workshops that teach how to do these cut stump treatments. We have a couple of those coming up. One in August, one in September. You can find that on our events page. If you're working with herbaceous plants, a foliar spray or a manual pull, depending on the species you're working with again. If you're working with vines, if you've got a mature or a climbing vine like invasive bittersweet, those have a woody stem and you can do a cut stump treatment on them. Otherwise, you're going to have to be doing a foliar spray for some of those immature crawling vines. That it just you can do raking for it too. I've heard people doing that. It just depends on the root system. It depends on the specific species. For some species specific information, you can go to Michigan.gov/invasives. That lists out all of the invasive species in Michigan, including all of the species that we talked about today. Again, that Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, they have a plethora of species, not even that are just in Michigan, but throughout the entire Midwest. And you can also go to our website. You can also contact us if you have questions about doing a treatment for something. I did have somebody also ask me about identifying invasive Phragmites, and I would direct you to the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. They have a lot of really, really great resources for looking for frag. If you're interested in helping out on public lands, you can, again, submit those sightings to MISN. They do have an app that you can use. Sometimes it's a little finicky, but you can also go onto their website and you can do submissions that way as well. And again, those come back to the SISMA coordinators for that area. So even if you're not in our service area, you're downstate, you're up in the UP, you can make that submission. And then it will go back to the coordinator who's working in that area. And of course, you can participate in volunteer work days. Like I said, land conservancies, land trusts, nature centers, conservation districts, other SISMAs. A lot of us are hosting these events. So it's just a matter of finding the people in your area who are hosting those events that you can get out there and help. Success stories of early detection species. We already talked about HWA. That is literally the epitome of early detection success. Some of the other species that we kind of consider to be an early detection success would be blue limegrass. That is a common ornamental grass that people plant, especially people who live on the lakeshore, because they're often living in just sand. It's very similar looking to our native dune grasses, except it's more blue and it puts out a bigger seed head on it. And those can actually get into the dunes, spread throughout. And there was a big push several years back about finding blue limegrass out on the beaches and digging it up. Now it's very rare. I haven't seen any in several years. Giant hogweed was another one. That was a big push thanks to, there was a news story that went out. Hogweed has the sap that's phytotoxic, which means if you get the sap on you and then you go out into the sun, it can actually cause burns. Some of them can be quite severe. There was a news story that went out that a child had been playing in the field, got into some hogweed and actually severely injured himself. So there was a really big push to control giant hogweed populations. So that is another big success story. We only had a couple of populations. We haven't seen anything in a few years. We plan to go back and check our historical sites this year to see if it's still that way. I also had a question about a combination of monitoring schemes providing the most effective for early detection. And that is literally surveying. You know, like I said, we have people out doing Hemlock woolly Adelgid surveys right now, but we also occasionally have survey crews who will go out. We also rely a lot on the public because we can't be everywhere at once. There are just 3 of us at ISN. So we really rely on the public to keep an eye out for these and report them when they see them. And then we can go out and confirm that and then take steps following that. I also had another question about the correlation between early measures being taken and the cost. So invasive species is a very costly thing that the federal government pays out for, that the states pay out for individually. And there are several studies out there that prove that catching things early and finding the sources of invasives, where invasive species are coming from and stopping them there is a huge, huge money saver. Because then you're not just fighting a losing battle where you're just throwing money into it and you're like, well, now we'll go back and we'll get another 3 acres done. So it's billions of dollars. I don't remember exactly how much, billions of dollars every year go into invasive species treatments that go throughout multiple organizations and levels of government. But yes, early detection drastically cuts down on that. And that was the last of the submitted questions. So we have plenty of time for other questions, but Shelley is telling me that there are no questions. If you have any questions, we'll give it a couple of minutes. Otherwise, you have my contact information on there. I will be completely upfront and say, honestly, emailing me is a lot quicker than trying to get a hold of me on the phone. I'm in and out of meetings, working on grants, shooting a quick email is a lot easier. And then at least knowing what you're looking for as well. That way I can be prepared with information for you when I do call you. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Hopefully you learned something important. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.